Thank you. It's really nice to be here. Sorry, you can see a bit of the clutter in the background of my study here. This is the problem with everything being on Zoom these days. I guess, so I'm gonna try to share, I prepared a few slides, but I'm happy to use this time however you guys would find the most kind of interesting as well. So I'm curious, just while I figure this out, I see there's 22 people here. Where is everyone coming from? Kind of what grades, whereabouts in the world?
So because the Girl Up Coalition is mainly in Boston, a lot of the members and participants are also in Massachusetts and also nearby areas in New England. A lot of us are pretty young. We're ranging from middle school to also college. And so we have an audience that's really passionate about female rights and also gender equality.
Awesome, that's really cool. Okay, so I guess what I was gonna do is tell you a little bit about who I am, my background, how I got into science, the science that I've been doing around COVID for the last 9 months and kind of what we've learned. And then I guess just a few thoughts about being a woman in science and how to kind of engage with people and that kind of thing. So gonna try to leave plenty of time for questions. Also feel free to interrupt me as I go along. I'm happy to be interrupted and answer questions as I go, either about what I'm saying or other kind of, anything that kind of occurs to you. All right, so can I put this in present mode? All right, so you should be seeing the screen, right? Cool. Okay, all right, so I called my talk From Ancient Coins to COVID-19, and I hope why will become obvious as I go through, but just in case it doesn't, I think one thing that for me is really key in science is to sort of follow what interests you and follow your passions, and you never kind of know where that's going to lead. And in my case, that led from archaeology all the way into viral genetics, and I think that's not a problem. I think some people see this as, you have to be this kind of scientist or that kind of scientist. For me, I think diversity and these winding paths just kind of enriches what you know and what you bring to solving a problem. So as was mentioned in the introduction, I'm a scientist at the Broad Institute. So I put a picture of the Broad here. So obviously we're in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And this is, if anyone's not familiar with the Broad, we're a biomedical research institute. So kind of between Harvard and MIT, and there's about 2,000 scientists and non-scientists all kind of working to solve problems around human disease. And that can be infectious disease, as in my case, it can be cancer, neurodegenerative diseases, schizophrenia, a whole manner of different kind of problems, all kind of in the sphere of biomedicine. As was mentioned before, I'm from the UK. I'm not originally from here. So I grew up in a small city called Newcastle upon Tyne, which is kind of close to the Scottish border. And I'm not one of these people who always wanted to be a scientist. I think some people will say, I always wanted to be a scientist. In my case, that wasn't really the case. And I think that's partly because I didn't know any scientists. So no one around me was a scientist. And so I dressed up as a ballet dancer or as a pirate. Like, these were things that I knew how to be, or things that I knew that people could be, but I didn't really know about being a scientist. But one day I went to a museum, like a museum of natural history, and I saw an exhibition by some college students studying some pottery from different civilizations. And it said that they were from a university, and I asked my mom about it, and I got really curious. And that was the first time I really realized that my interest in archaeology and history could actually be a thing that I studied or be a job. And so from then I was dead set on being an archaeologist. And I went to college and I studied archaeology. And then one day I heard a talk from a professor in France talking about genetics and evolution. And that kind of pivoted me. So I switched and I followed this person, and I wrote to him and said, can I join your lab? I think what you do is super cool. And I started a PhD in France. So I'm up to move to Paris. And for 5 years I worked there, and then I came to Boston. And so I think, for me, this was a lot about kind of following my passion and also asking big questions. I try to balance between asking big questions and solving important problems. So I think there are a lot of like really fascinating big questions about the world and how it works. And then it's important to connect these to tangible issues that we have in society today. And so in my case, the big question that fascinates me is this. And so I am really interested in how humans have evolved and adapted to our diseases and how the diseases have evolved and adapted to us. And this is like a kind of co-evolutionary sort of battle. And this is a quote from Alice Through the Looking Glass from the book by Lewis Carroll, which I think sums this up really well. And the Red Queen says, "Now here you see, it takes all the running you can do to keep in the same place. If you want to get somewhere else, you must run at least twice as fast as that." And I think this really sums up that idea of, constantly us trying to constantly outsmart our pathogens and the pathogens kind of trying to outsmart us. And so that's the big question that drives me. But the important problem that I try to work on is how we can use this, kind of evolution, and particularly the evolution of pathogens. How can we kind of turn it against them? And how can we use genetics to track how pathogens are spreading, to understand how they're evolving, and use that for public health? So I'm going to just show a quick video of like how approximately we do that, which was made by the Broad Institute a little while ago to sort of communicate this idea of using genetics to understand pathogens.
When a disease outbreak appears, doctors, public health officials, and scientists want to learn everything they can about the cause as quickly as possible, be it a virus, bacterium, parasite, or other pathogen. Where did it come from? Where is it spreading, and how, and among whom? Epidemiologists have many tools at their disposal to help answer these questions, such as contact tracing. Genetics researchers and microbiologists are finding that a pathogen's own genome can help reveal even more about what it's doing, and help guide public health officials as they work to slow and stop its spread. By gathering and sequencing pathogen samples from as many patients in as many places as they can, and comparing those genomes against each other, geneticists can learn several things. For instance, they can tell whether a virus is spreading from person to person, or through contact with an animal or other reservoir. They can see whether a parasite arrived from somewhere close by, or from far away, and whether it arrived more than once. They can build timelines showing how long a bacterium has been circulating somewhere, and see how drug resistance emerges. All of this information from genomic epidemiology complements traditional epidemiology and can help hospitals and public health officials best decide what to do to bring an outbreak under control.
All right, so that's pretty much what we do. We do this thing called genomic epidemiology, and we've been applying this to COVID-19. And so the way that we do it, they said in the video, we use the genetics of the virus or the bacteria to understand how it's spreading. And so what we do is we construct these things called phylogenetic trees. And that's what I'm showing here on the left is a big phylogenetic tree. And the way you can understand this is kind of like a family tree. It's showing you the relatedness. And so two things that are very related will be close together. Two things very genetically different will be far apart. And so we can kind of connect the dots of the viral genetic sequences in order to see where it came from, where it's spread to, and how it's spreading kind of at different levels, both globally and locally within a community. And so one thing that's really cool is that scientists all over the world have been doing this. So we've been doing it in Boston, but people have been doing it all over the world. And so now we have like hundreds of thousands of these genetic sequences of SARS-CoV-2 that we can compare, and we can see, where it's spreading. So like in the case of Boston, we see that a lot of it came from Europe, and we can draw these connections, but we can only do it because we're doing that work, and the scientists in Europe are doing that work, and the scientists in China and Africa and everything else are kind of doing it too. So we looked particularly in Boston. So we were interested in kind of scientists everywhere was doing this, and could we kind of add Boston to that picture, or Massachusetts to that picture? And so we had 800 samples from people with SARS-CoV-2, and I'm putting them on a map of Massachusetts here. So you can see that most of our samples come from the Boston area and kind of sort of a roundabout. So we had 800 samples. And the first thing we could see is that the virus comes into Boston many, many times. And so by comparing the genetics of the different viruses in Boston, we could see that there's lots of very distinct ones. And that shows us that it comes in around over 100 times, which really, I think, shows you just how connected our world is. You know, people were traveling. Even when we were told we weren't supposed to be traveling, people were still traveling all the time. The other thing that I think is really important about SARS-CoV-2 when we think about this genetic information and how we can communicate that to public health and to actually make changes is that very few of these introductions actually cause the majority of cases. And you've probably heard about these super spreading events. So SARS-CoV-2 spreading particularly well in closed environments like churches or cruise ships or big gatherings. And we really see, like the genetics is really cool because it gives us evidence that supports that. We really see that this is the case, that most cases don't spread and a few really explode. And I think one way that we can illustrate this, so now I'm showing you a similar kind of tree, but instead of showing it for the whole world, this is just for Massachusetts. And I'm coloring things on this tree in a few different ways. So in orange are some people who went to a conference in Boston in late February. And in red are some residents and staff from homeless shelters. And if you can kind of visually trace these lines, these are early samples from February, and they're connected through these lines to these later samples in red. And so what that tells us is that the virus comes from the conference into the community, spreads in the community, and eventually finds its way into homeless shelters. And for me, the message that this sends is the virus connects unconnected communities. We don't think of those communities as being linked, but they are, because the virus spreads people in the grocery store, people on the T, wherever it is, this chain this transmission chain can get quite long. And so your actions can impact people you've never met. And I think that's what makes this pandemic so challenging, but so important for us to kind of come together, is that it really is, it affects the whole community and people that we don't know, and our actions have, ripple effects that go out beyond this. And with the genetics, we can see that. So we worked really super hard on this, like when everyone kind of got sent home and, all the stuff shut down, we kind of ramped up to do this work. And I think one thing that the whole experience taught me is just how much science is a team sport and how important it is to have a great team. And so either to join a great team, or if you can't find one, to make one yourself. And I'm lucky that my awesome team involves a ton of really incredible women. So this is my boss here, Pardis, and she's a phenomenal mentor and a phenomenal advocate for everybody in science, and particularly for women in science. But I really love this picture. This was from a Zoom meeting that we had early on when we were starting this work. And I don't know if you can see, but with the exception of Cameron down there, it's all women. And I think this is something that I'm really lucky to be part of a team that really supports women. And I think we do just have so many incredible women in science, like the ones that you showed sort of historically, but so many right now. The other thing that I think is really cool about this is not all of these women are scientists, but all of these women are in science, right? And so I think to make a difference in STEM, you don't have to be a scientist. And so if you love numbers and finance, this Molly here does finances. She's not a scientist, she helps us with the finances. Or Sherry is an engineer, so she loves building stuff, building tools. So she's part of the team as well. Or a lot of these people are project managers and other things. So they're all part of solving these scientific problems, but a scientist can be many different things. Anybody can be a scientist, but I think you also don't have to be a scientist to really advocate for STEM. Obviously, a lot of this is powered by really awesome female scientists who also work in the lab. And so this is Adrian and Kim, who were two of the guys really working in our lab to do this work. Something else that I think is super cool about science, and one of the things that I'm really passionate about, is global health. I think these problems that we tackle don't only affect us, they affect people all over the world. And if we can solve them together, we're stronger. So one organization that we're part of is something called the African Centers of Excellence for Genomics of Infectious Disease. And I'm really fortunate to have, to be part of some really diverse teams through this work, and also work with some incredible women in Nigeria and in Senegal down at the bottom. These are colleagues who also work in their own countries trying to understand infectious diseases and how they spread. And we work together to tackle these problems together. And I think these kind of diverse teams with very different experiences really just enriches us and makes us much stronger to answer these questions. And actually, these guys here from Nigeria, while we were sequencing SARS-CoV-2 in Boston, they were doing the same thing in Nigeria, which, as you can probably imagine, is a ton more challenging than doing it here with all of the resources that we have access to. And they actually published the very first African sequence of SARS-CoV-2, which was a huge achievement. I think the other thing that is really important to me in science is that we often think that science is a very fact-based thing, and it is, like, plenty of numbers and facts, but it's also a really creative activity. Thinking about questions, and even more importantly, thinking about how to solve the questions, requires a ton of creativity and requires a lot of different perspectives in order to do that. I also think science should be fun, and you should do it because you enjoy it. And that you should be able to be yourself in doing it. Because I think each of us in our own different backgrounds and experiences, we come to a problem with a different perspective. And so in our lab, we like to make these holiday cards, and we make them every year. And this is kind of our creative outlet beyond our work that allows us to express our individuality and our creativity and just have a bit of fun together at the end of each year after working really hard on these different questions. And the last thing I wanted to say that I think is really important is that, science is about gaining knowledge and about learning and about solving problems and about asking these hard questions, but it doesn't get us anywhere unless we tell people about it. And so I think it's really important to share what you know. And that's why I think events like this are so phenomenal, and why organizations like Gallup are so great, that it really brings people together around these questions and helps to get the word out there about science. And so, whether that's through education and outreach. So this is a lesson I did in 8th grade in a Cambridge middle school, where we used colored liquids to show how a virus spreads, and everyone got to wear face shields and gloves and make a bit of a mess. So through that, or social media, I think it's never been easier to communicate science, but it's also never been more important. I think the easier that it gets through social media to spread science, it also gets easier to spread incorrect fact. And the more that happens and the easier it becomes, the more important it is for scientists to step up and to correct the record, or to address the facts. And even just with family and friends, you might have family or friends who think differently than you do, and maybe disagree with certain things. And I think even those conversations are really important in starting that conversation and getting the message about kind of science out there. And I think, at least in SARS-CoV-2, in the viral stuff, we've got a lot of big conversations to have soon. The vaccine just being approved yesterday, I think, is a really big one. I think there's going to be a lot of conversations around vaccine safety, and scientists really have a responsibility to play a role there in communicating facts around that. But it could be anything. You might not be interested in viruses. You might be interested in climate change, or any of the other really big questions out there right now. And I would just really encourage you to learn as much as you can, and then share that knowledge as widely as you can. And so I think that's it. I hope I have a little bit